In the early morning hours of May 8th, 2014, a woman named Marie Michael awoke to something strange in the small city of Grimes, Iowa. She had been sleeping in a guest bedroom at her adult son Justin's house, but was disturbed by a creaking sound at her door. Only half aware of what was going on through the fog of tiredness, Marie next thought she saw a red light briefly shining in her direction, as well as a dark figure standing in the doorway. She barely had time to consider either, though, before both had vanished. It all happened so fast that if that were it, perhaps Marie might have questioned whether it had even happened at all. That was until seconds later, when she heard 4 loud pops in rapid succession. They were all coming from Justin's bedroom. As Marie was about to find out, her eyes weren't playing tricks on her, and she hadn't been dreaming. She was trapped in a nightmare that was all too real. She wasn't the only one, though. At that exact moment, Justin's fiancée, Angie, was awoken by the same terrifying noises, the same red light, and the same dark figure. What awaited her when she turned on the lights was more horrifying than she ever could have imagined. When police arrived, they would be quickly faced with an equally terrifying and perplexing situation. Though the culprit's method was straightforward, their motive was anything but. It was now up to detectives to square how a crime that appeared so personal could be targeted at someone seemingly without an enemy in the world. To those that knew him, Justin Michael was always someone who lived life to the fullest. From the time that he was a child, his family recognized in him a sense of adventure and an openness to trying new things. He had a passion for the outdoors, loved camping and playing sports, and developed an appreciation for history and travel early on in life. Justin's family had moved around a lot when he was a kid, but they had finally put down permanent roots in the city of Urbandale in 1997, when Justin was in his early teens. He had gone on to attend Iowa State University, where he graduated with a degree in public service and administration in agriculture. Justin's natural sense of excitement and curiosity about the world was kindled further when he went on a mission trip to Egypt with his father when he was in college. It was a formative experience, one that sparked in him a desire to help others and showed him the value of community service. His brother would later say in an interview that the trip had helped motivate Justin in all aspects of his life. After finishing school, Justin began working as an operations analyst for the financial services company Wells Fargo. It was a good job, but at the same time, as always, it was hardly the only thing Justin had going on in his life. He had a large circle of friends, was involved in local sports leagues, and regularly volunteered with the non-profit housing organization Habitat for Humanity. As full as Justin's life was, though, there was still one piece missing: a partner to share it with. He finally found that in June of 2013, when he met a school teacher named Angie Huel. When Angie met Justin, she could instantly tell that he was different than the guys that she had dated in the past. He was driven, outgoing and personable, and brought excitement and adventure into her life. The pair hit it off almost immediately, and within just a few months were engaged to be married. They moved in together at Justin's house in the city of Grimes, Iowa, located just outside of Des Moines. Angie and Justin chose a wedding date for July of 2014, just over a year after they had first met. The ceremony was set to take place in the Outer Banks area of North Carolina, a favorite childhood vacation spot for Justin and his family. While the weeks and months leading up to the wedding were filled with tons of preparations, like always, Justin still found time to fit in plenty of other things. He planned a summer camping trip with his brother, started working on the garden he had always wanted at the house, and of course, even found space for a mini adventure. On May 3rd of that year, he and Angie went skydiving. She would later recall that in usual fashion, she was scared to death, while Justin couldn't have been more excited. As they smiled for a picture in their skydiving gear that day, it likely seemed like just one more fun memory in a lifetime of experiences to come. Sadly, little did they know that this adventure would be the last that they would ever share together. Just 5 days later, a tragedy that no one saw coming would change everything. The night of May 7th, 2014, was like any other for Angie Huel and Justin Michael. That evening, the couple went to Justin's sister's house for dinner, where they discussed the upcoming wedding, as well as preparations that still needed to be made. To help out, Justin's mother Marie had also come to town and was staying with him and Angie for a few days. The family members talked until about 10 p.m., at which point Justin, Angie, and Marie left to go back to their house on Southeast Jacob Street. They went to sleep shortly after arriving home at about 11, with Marie set up in a guest room and Angie and Justin retiring to the master bedroom. For the next several hours, it seemed like just an ordinary night. That was, until about 3:20 a.m., when Marie heard a noise and awoke to find the door to her room slowly cracking open. Before she could do anything, a narrow but vibrant beam of red light was shone in her direction. At the same time, she thought that she could make out a dark figure in the doorway. The figure was only there for a moment before it went away. Unbeknownst to Marie, it was now heading for the master bedroom. Just a few short seconds later, Angie was jolted awake by 4 loud pops in rapid succession. She got up to see the same red light and dark figure that Marie had witnessed, only this time it appeared to be hurrying out her bedroom door. For a split second, Angie thought the figure might have been Justin getting up, until she realized that he was still lying next to her. She tried to shake him awake, but to her horror, he wasn't moving. That's when she heard an absolutely terrifying gurgling noise. When she turned on the light, she realized that it was Justin. He had been shot 4 times in the head and neck. Though emergency responders were immediately called to the scene, sadly, there was nothing anyone could do. Justin had been dead within seconds of the brutal attack, to the point that his arms and legs hadn't even moved from the sleeping position he'd been in. Shortly after Justin was pronounced dead, investigators took their first detailed look at the crime scene. On top of the bed were 4 9mm shell casings from the murder weapon, along with 4 corresponding bullet holes in the wall behind the head of the bed. Based on powder burn marks to Justin's face, detectives determined that the gunshots that had killed him had been fired at close range. It seemed that the shooter had wanted to make sure that he only hit Justin, suggesting that the attack was extremely targeted. Despite this, it appeared that whoever had committed the crime wanted authorities to believe that this was a burglary gone wrong. A DVD player in the living room had been partially unplugged and pulled from the TV cabinet where it was usually placed. A yellow sweatshirt that hadn't been there when Angie and Justin went to bed was also found lying on the floor. Nothing had actually been taken, however. Beyond this, there was very little physical evidence at the scene. The back door to the house had been forced open, suggesting this is where the killer had entered. However, there were no usable fingerprints found, nor anything that lent itself to potential DNA analysis. Though for the sake of thoroughness, authorities did consider the theory that a random intruder could be behind the crime. The idea was quickly dispensed with. The way in which Justin had been attacked was just too brutal and targeted for detectives to believe that burglary was the motive. Besides, if this were about getting rid of potential witnesses, why hadn't anyone else been attacked? Especially Angie, who was literally lying next to Justin and who could have potentially gotten a look at the suspect. The killer had also deliberately passed over Marie's room after looking inside. Everything pointed to the murder being extremely personal. But if this were the case, it led to 2 obvious questions. Who could have wanted Justin Michael dead? And for what reason? At the same time that the crime scene was being processed for evidence, detectives brought Angie and Marie in for questioning. They were talked to simultaneously in 2 separate rooms, both to speed up the process of gathering information and to compare what they were saying for any sign of inconsistencies. At first, detectives found both of the women's behavior to be odd. They spoke with little emotion, and interviewers felt that Angie in particular appeared to be preoccupied with other things, like informing her employer that she wouldn't be at work that day. However, it was quickly determined that both women were simply in shock. Neither had yet been able to process the terror and unimaginable loss they had just experienced. As an aside, I think it's worth acknowledging here for a second what an impossible situation something like this probably is on both sides. On the one hand, I completely understand that authorities have to treat everyone as a potential suspect at the beginning of an investigation. But on the other hand, I think too often people tend to have this notion that there's a right or a wrong way to respond to a devastating tragedy like this. And when victims respond in the so-called wrong way, there's this temptation to immediately cast them as suspicious, even when it's very often not an actual indication of guilt or innocence. I'm not really trying to make any sort of a huge point here. It's just something that struck me when I was doing the research for this part of the case, so I thought it might be worth sharing. Just something to think about. Anyway, back to the story. During questioning, both Marie and Angie told investigators roughly the same set of details. They described seeing a dark figure in their rooms that they now knew was the suspect, though neither of them had managed to get a look at his face. Based on details they provided about the red light, detectives concluded that it was likely the beam from a laser sight that had been attached to the killer's weapon. When detectives got to potential motives, though, both women drew a blank. Neither could think of any reason that someone would have wanted Justin dead. Authorities pressed further. Surely there was something that could have gotten him into trouble. Was there a financial motive? Was he involved in drugs, gambling? Was there infidelity in he and Angie's relationship? The answer to all of these questions was no. The fact was, everyone seemed to love Justin. In her interview, Angie described him as literally the nicest person she had ever met. With Justin's personal life looking like a dead end motive-wise, detectives delved further into Angie's past, looking for any potential red flags. Here, too, there was very little of interest, though at some point, Angie remembered something concerning. She said that back in November of the previous year, her car was vandalized pretty badly while it had been parked out on the street overnight. 3 of the windows had been broken, it was keyed all over, and it looked like it had been hit in places with a bat. It was the only vehicle on the street that had been damaged. While this had certainly been upsetting, at the time Angie didn't think much of it. As soon as investigators heard this, though, they theorized that it might be connected. That's when they began to ask about her prior romantic relationships. Angie stated that before Justin, she had dated a guy named Andy Wegner. They had been together for 3 years and had broken up in March of 2013, a few months before she had met Justin. However, Angie said that the breakup had been mostly amicable. There was no massive blow-up between them. They had simply grown apart and realized that they were moving in different directions. The two had even continued to live together for a couple of months after the breakup to give themselves time to get back on their feet. Angie said that she really didn't think Andy was the type of person who would do something like this. Besides, last she had heard, he was happily part of a new relationship. After more questions, Angie remembered that she had also briefly seen another guy around the time of her breakup named David. She said that this barely qualified as a relationship, though. So much so that she had trouble even remembering his last name, which was Moffat. Angie and David had met at a bar and casually texted for a while afterwards, but it didn't really go anywhere. Part of the reason was that she didn't get the impression that David was very serious about dating. That sort of made sense, though, because he was a couple of years younger than her, and she figured that he just wasn't looking to settle down. Angie hadn't really thought about it since, because around the time her and David's text conversations fizzled, she had met Justin. She hadn't heard from David since. With little else to go on, investigators decided to look into both Andy and David further to see if there was anything else that stuck out. They didn't have to search for long before something caught their eye. After questioning Angie, detectives decided to run a weapons permit check for both Andy Wegner and David Moffat. While both men came back negative, the searching did unearth something else. It turned out that one of them had been involved in a car accident on the morning of the murder. Interestingly, it had taken place just 30 minutes after the shooting, and roughly 5.5 miles from the crime scene. The deputy who responded to the incident said that he had gotten a call that morning about a crashed vehicle in a ditch near Highway 141 and 102nd Street. The accident had happened on a gravel road in an isolated, mostly rural area just outside of the city of Granger. When the officer arrived at the scene, he immediately spotted the vehicle, though no one was inside. Seconds later, a man came running up to him. He was covered in sweat and looked like he had been off in the overgrown area next to the road, judging by the presence of burrs and grass on his clothing. The man identified himself as David Moffat, and all of the paperwork and identification he provided seemed to check out. That being said, David didn't have insurance for his car, so the vehicle was impounded. The officer had waited around long enough for David to get into a cab, though left the scene immediately after, as by that time additional help was needed at the crime scene in Grimes. Upon learning about the strange accident, detectives investigating Justin Michael's murder were intrigued. Their suspicions were raised even further when they learned that David Moffat lived on the complete opposite side of the county, in the city of Pleasant Hill. They were eager to learn what he could have been doing out on this remote section of road at 4 o'clock in the morning, so close to their crime scene, especially when his home was nearly 30 miles in the opposite direction. Before speaking to David directly, though, detectives first went to the crash site to take a look around. It was a big job considering the size of the area, but even so, it wasn't long before strange things started to be found. For starters, authorities recovered blue rubber gloves which had been scattered all over the place. They theorized that if these had been used by the killer, they could explain why no fingerprints had been found at the crime scene. A Kindle e-reader was next to be discovered. Interestingly, when police took a closer look, they found that someone had recently typed the word Grimes into the device's search bar. If there were any doubts remaining that the crash site was connected to Justin's murder, these were extinguished when detectives made their next discovery. It was 2 full magazines of 9mm ammunition, the exact same kind that had been used in the shooting. However, there was one final thing uncovered at the scene that would throw investigators for a serious loop. Inside of a shoebox was a receipt for an oil change from a local car dealership. The receipt belonged to Andy Wegner. After the discovery of the receipt at the crash site, detectives tracked down Andy Wegner, who was brought in for an interview. He denied involvement in anything related to Justin's death, and said that he had no animosity towards him or his ex-girlfriend Angie. Andy characterized the relationship much the same way that she had to police. He said that they had simply gone their separate ways after the breakup, and that he was now happily seeing someone else. In fact, his new girlfriend could account for most of his whereabouts on the morning of the murder. He also had receipts for dinner the previous night, and said that he hadn't even been in the city of Grimes for about a month. In addition to answering questions, Andy consented to both a home and vehicle search, and overall, detectives felt he was being honest and straightforward with them. When they asked him about his last oil change receipt to see how he would respond, Andy replied that he thought it was probably in his car somewhere, but that he couldn't say for sure. He said that, like a lot of people, he simply threw his receipts in the back seat, disposing of them every once in a while when he cleaned the vehicle out. At roughly the same time the detectives were interviewing Andy, other investigators working the case were conducting a search at David Moffat's house. They had managed to obtain a warrant thanks to the circumstantial evidence from the car crash, and so were allowed to legally enter even though David wasn't home. Once inside the property, it didn't take long to find more potential evidence. This included packaging for hearing protection, as well as camouflage face paint. However, to the surprise of investigators, the 2 most important finds once again pointed at Andy Wegner. These were a receipt in a duffel bag in the garage for service to the crashed car, and more alarmingly, a bill of sale for a high-point carbine long gun. Both documents had Andy's name on them. The bill of sale for the gun was dated May 4th, 2014, just 4 days before the murder of Justin Michael. This meant that authorities now likely knew the type of weapon that had been used in the crime, and when it had been purchased. More importantly, though, it gave detectives another lead to follow up on: the person who had sold the weapon, a man named Drew Ballman. Authorities were able to track down Drew at his home in Sigourney, Iowa, about 100 miles east of the crime scene. Right away, he was cooperative and was horrified to learn that the weapon he had sold just days earlier might have been involved in a brutal crime. Drew told detectives that he had put the long gun up for sale online and hadn't received much interest initially, until out of nowhere a man contacted him who was adamant about making the purchase. He had traveled to meet him at a local gas station where they had made the sale. Drew had insisted on doing everything by the book, having both him and the buyer sign a copy of the bill of sale. He also checked the man's ID, which had identified him as Andy Wegner. At this point, authorities were thoroughly confused. All of the hard evidence they were uncovering seemed to point at Andy, but all of these finds had been made at scenes linked to David Moffat. Police showed Drew pictures of both men, but he wasn't able to say for sure which of the men he had met. He said that the buyer had been wearing a hat and dark sunglasses during the sale. However, Drew was able to help detectives in one other major way. In addition to keeping good records of his gun sales, he also kept most of the spent bullets and casings that he fired from his weapons. He handed over a box of these from the high-point carbine that he had sold to the buyer. By comparing these with the bullets and casings recovered at the Grimes crime scene, authorities were able to definitively prove that they had been fired by the same gun. This was their murder weapon. The question still remained, though: who was actually responsible for Justin Michael's murder? That's when authorities decided it was time to pay another visit to David Moffat's house. During the second search of David's property, authorities obtained a more substantive search warrant and were now paying close attention to things that they might have missed before. It wasn't long before disturbing discoveries started to be made. First, authorities uncovered a plastic tub hidden in the basement which they didn't think had been there before. Inside was more ammunition of the same brand and caliber that had been used in the murder, a box and parts to a laser sight, as well as a pair of muddy shoes that matched the shoebox that had been found near the scene of the car crash. At the bottom of the plastic tub was a laptop, which was submerged in about an inch of water. It was sent away for testing with the hopes that even if it was damaged, data on the hard drive could be recovered. While searching through the trash, detectives next found another receipt. At first, it appeared relatively mundane. It was for a Mountain Dew and a chocolate bar, which had been purchased from a gas station. However, when investigators took a closer look, they realized that the receipt wasn't just from any gas station. It was from the same gas station in Sigourney, Iowa, where the murder weapon had been bought, and was from the same date and time. Detectives contacted the gas station and were able to obtain surveillance footage. It revealed that David Moffat had been the one who had met with Drew Ballman and obtained the gun. That wasn't all, though. At roughly the same time that they learned this, investigators also received the recovered data from the laptop in David's basement. One file in particular stood out. It was a scan of David's driver's license, which he had edited in Photoshop. He had changed his name on the card to Andy Wegner. As a result, authorities came to two chilling conclusions. First, that David was responsible for Justin's murder, and second, that he had been trying to frame Andy Wegner for the crime. However, there was still one piece missing. Why? With an overwhelming amount of evidence now pointing at David Moffat, investigators placed him under arrest and charged him with the murder of Justin Michael. Once in custody, though, David refused to talk and immediately requested a lawyer. It seemed that if the truth about his motive was finally going to come out, it would have to do so in court. When the trial began in June of 2015, David and his lawyers immediately threw the prosecution a curveball. David pleaded insanity. In particular, David said that the killing had been the result of side effects from medication he had been taking to treat his depression. It was this medication, he claimed, which had caused his, quote, homicidal ideations. That, and a tragic coincidence. It turned out that just a few months after David and Angie's casual relationship, in August of 2013, he had gotten a new job. That job was at Wells Fargo. By complete chance, David had ended up not only in the same workplace as Justin Michael, but in the same department. It was through this proximity to Justin that he learned of his engagement to Angie, when congratulations started to go through the office about a month later. The realization prompted feelings of animosity towards Justin that had started to eat away at David. They didn't go away even after he left the job several months later. While prosecutors didn't dispute the eerie coincidence of David and Justin working together, they did doubt the authenticity of his insanity plea. In order for this to be genuine, David would have to show that he didn't know right from wrong at the time of the murder, and that he didn't understand the consequences of his actions. Prosecutors stated that there was plenty of evidence to suggest that while David's actions were unthinkable, he was nonetheless fully aware of what he was doing when he carried them out. In other words, he was motivated by jealousy, not insanity. They argued that David was obsessed with Angie Huel, and felt that Justin had somehow stolen the life from him that he was supposed to have. That's when he had created a plan to not only get Justin out of the picture, but to pin the crime on Andy Wegner. To support their theory, the prosecution showed evidence of the disturbing search history taken from David's computer. It included phrases such as love triangle murders, how to get away with murder, and what fruit most resembles a human skull. The search history further revealed that David had extensively looked up information about Justin, Angie, and Andy Wegner online. There was also a final chilling piece of evidence that investigators uncovered during their searches of David's home, one that arguably went further than anything else towards illustrating his premeditation. It was a collection of meticulous, handwritten surveillance notes. These notes included Justin's home address, information about local traffic light patterns, and possible escape routes from the area. They even included detailed observations about the activities of Justin and Angie's neighbors, such as when they turned their lights out at night. Unbeknownst to Justin and Angie, they had been stalked by David for weeks as he created these notes in the lead-up to the murder. At the end of the trial, David Moffat was found guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree burglary in connection with the killing of Justin Michael. He was sentenced to life in prison and is currently incarcerated at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison. While a good chunk of the cases we cover on this channel are pretty heavy, I gotta say, this one hit me especially hard. A big reason for that is likely that I'm almost exactly the same age Justin was when he died, and I'm at a similar point in my life. I can't help but dwell on how much he must have wanted to do, how much he still wanted to experience that he'll never get to. Moreover, how many things his friends, family, and fiancé probably wanted to do and experience with him, only to forever be left picking up the pieces. I can only hope that all of them have found some semblance of peace, knowing that the time Justin did get, he spent living life to the fullest. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a minute to thank our amazing supporters over on Patreon. As many of you are aware, our situation on YouTube always seems to be a bit uncertain, but our patrons help to ensure that we can continue to make content like this long term without having to worry as much about what surprises might be thrown our way. Plus, patrons also get access to 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. If you'd like to help support the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/crimezone to join. You can also find that link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care.